All right, we are live here on Pass the Mic, hosted by The Witness. So I'll do my stereotypical open. Greetings and God bless. Welcome to a live episode of Pass the Mic, dynamic voices for a diverse church, powered by The Witness, a Black Christian collective. I'm your host, Tyler Burns. You can follow me on Twitter at Burns23. Follow at your own risk. And joining me, as always, is the president of The Witness, Mr. Jemar Tisby. Brother, how you doing tonight?
Sleep deprived, but excited, my friend. This is an all-star lineup we have.
Yes, I'm so excited to get into this conversation and introduce our esteemed panel. But before we do that, we want to encourage you to do two main things. The first is whenever you're watching this, we want you to click the subscribe button for The Witness YouTube page. This is just the first of many conversations that we'll be having using this medium. We also want you to, time permitting, we'll be answering some questions on Twitter. So if you want to ask some questions of the panel, any particular people, you can do so on Twitter by using the hashtag #WitnessLiveChat. That's #WitnessLiveChat. And this conversation is hosted by The Witness. And for those who don't know, if it's your first interaction with us, we are a Black Christian collective that engages issues of religion, race, justice, and culture from a biblical perspective. We consciously draw on the expansive Black church tradition to address matters of personal faith while also speaking to issues of public righteousness. Now, because we are a Black Christian collective, we recognize that this conversation is from the perspective of, it's limited to the perspective of women and Black Christians. So it's not as diverse as it could be. So for those Christians who are not represented here, we just want to acknowledge this is not a comprehensive or an exhaustive look at all of Christianity, whether denominationally or convictionally. So we'll just be speaking from our perspective. So we do want to set that expectation at the beginning. So let's introduce our panel. I'll start with Miss Lisa Fields. Lisa Fields is a Christian apologist, writer, and speaker. She received her Master of Divinity degree from Liberty University with a focus in theology. She is the founder and president of the wonderful organization, the Jude 3 Project. And the primary mission of the Jude 3 Project is to help the Christian community know what they believe and why they believe it. It is distinctive and a strong emphasis in equipping those of African descent in the United States and beyond. And Lisa is also the host of the Jude 3 Project podcast, which every single one of you should subscribe to right now. Lisa, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm honored that you would ask.
Yes, we've been trying to get Lisa on the podcast for a while, so we're honored that you're here. Okay, we've been trying so hard. Truth Table snatched her from us. We'll get to that later. But next we have Katelyn Beaty. Katelyn is a writer, editor, speaker, and self-proclaimed karaoke queen. Now, Katelyn, you know we're going to make you prove that one day. Okay.
I am ready. I'm ready for the challenge.
Right. She's a graduate of Calvin College and also studied theology at Oxford University. She's the first woman and the youngest person to become the managing editor for the magazine Christianity Today. She went on to launch a website for women called Hermeneutics, and her first book, entitled A Woman's Place, was released in 2016. She's written for The Washington Post, The Atlantic, The New York Times, and has commented on CNN, ABC, NPR, and now The Witness. Katelyn, thank you for joining us. It's an honor to have you.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation. It's an honor.
And then last but certainly not least is Miss Ekemini Uwan. She is no stranger to Pass the Mic, but for the uninitiated, she's a writer, speaker, and podcaster extraordinaire. She is also a self-proclaimed fashionista, which if you guys get a look at what she's wearing now, you know that she is not lying. She received her Master of Divinity degree from Westminster Theological Seminary, where she won the 2015 Green Prize Award in Apologetics. She has been quoted by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Mashable, and the Huffington Post Religion, among others. But most notably, she is one-third of the amazing, dynamic podcast, Truth Table, with Dr. Christina Edmondson and Michelle Higgins. Ekemini, it's always an honor to have you on the podcast with us.
Always good to be here with you guys. Thank you so much for having me.
Now, this conversation was sparked actually by something that Katelyn said on Twitter, responding to Ross Douthat's column on Is There an Evangelical Crisis? And before we get into the actual details, I remember watching Ekemini, and Katelyn had actually mentioned some people who are on this panel graciously. It's just some examples of Christians of color, Black Christians in particular, who have been representing what she calls the best of evangelicalism, but were not mentioned in the article itself, in the column. So seeing Ekemini and Jamar respond, it made me think this probably demands its own conversation, and we wanted to host that. So before we get into the specifics of this conversation, I want to kick it to our resident historian, Jemar Tisby, to enlighten us on what evangelical means. A lot of people use evangelical, but what's the framework that we'll be coming from tonight, Jemar?
Okay, so just for the sake of discussion, we're going to toss out a very well-known definition of evangelicalism. Now, let me give all the qualifications and caveats before folks just blow up social media. Listen, number one, it's a biblical word from the Greek word Evangelion, which simply means good news. And so in that sense, all Christians are good news people. But as we've come to define it socially, theologically, culturally, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. Now, the definition I'm going to use, I have a jumping off point. And so I fully recognize there are all kinds of gaps in this definition, all kinds of drawbacks. But folks will probably be familiar with historian David Bebbington's quadrilateral. And so these are 4 principles or 4 elements that he says are part of evangelicalism. And I'll just run through those quickly for the sake of a jumping off point, and then we can critique. And so Bebbington says, there's a quadrilateral of characteristics defined by conversionism, which is an emphasis on a personal conversion to Christianity. It rests on a traditional understanding of the Bible that interprets miracles as true and scripture as divinely inspired. There's a crucicentrism to it, which is a focus on Jesus Christ's sacrificial death on the cross. And there's actually an activist element to it in a couple of dimensions. One, in terms of your faith is active, something that you should live, but it's also active sort of more broadly in society as well. And those are just 4 descriptors. Now, the drawbacks are, of course, that you don't want to assume or imply that anyone who doesn't call themselves evangelical doesn't believe in those things. Like they're not emphasizing personal conversion or the cross or something like that. But again, just a jumping off point.
Now let's actually go around, and we'll start with Jamar since you just got done talking. I want to ask the question and get a one-word answer from everyone. Do you identify as an evangelical? So Jamar, do you identify as an evangelical? Why are you laughing? You knew this was coming. Why are you laughing?
I know. I'm just saying, okay. We'll unpack it all later. Okay. No.
Ekemini, do you identify as an evangelical?
No, I never have.
Lisa, do you identify as an evangelical?
Nope.
Katelyn, do you identify as an evangelical? All the pressure's on you now, Katelyn.
Okay. I thought about this before. Yes.
Okay. And I do not identify as an evangelical. So going in reverse order, we'll start with Katelyn. Tell us a little bit about your history with evangelicalism, both in the American form. And Katelyn, you actually define both the American and the international evangelical as well. So you speak to both of those in your research and work. So what's your history and how do you fit within evangelicalism?
Yeah, so my self-understanding as an evangelical is really rooted in my personal I have a personal conversion narrative. My parents, up until I was about 13, I would say were culturally Christian, but we got connected to a United Methodist church when I was a young teenager, and I had I came to Christ in a really profound and personal way. And the centrality of scripture, the centrality of the cross, the centrality of your faith informs everything you do. It's an active part of your life. All of that has really enriched my own faith journey and my spirituality. So I don't, it's the soil into which I was planted. I've invested a lot professionally in the evangelical world, was the managing editor at Christianity Today for several years. And I think in-house, it was exciting to think about presenting an evangelicalism that was perhaps different from what we see in the headlines, like hashtag not all evangelicals. This was before the election. And I will say, and if you've read anything I've written or just had a conversation with me, you would know that the election has really shaken me spiritually, not because I have lost faith. In fact, in some ways, my faith is vibrant in a way that it wasn't before. But my relationship with the evangelical community has really been shaken. And being aware of dynamics and kind of implicit blindnesses in the evangelical world that perhaps all of you have known about for a long time, and that's why you don't identify with evangelicalism. So it's been somewhat of an identity crisis, even though my faith is as strong as ever and the core theological convictions haven't changed.
That's very interesting. The soil that you've been planted in, that's a very vibrant phrase. Now, Lisa, you have connection to evangelicalism, proximity to it, but that's not kind of where you grew up. Talk about how where you came from within Black church context informs you saying nope. Like you didn't say no, you said nope. So that's kind of like a hard pass. So yeah, that's a period. That's a nah. Like no, I'm not. So you got to explain that. Build on why you said nope the way that you did.
Yeah, I wasn't even familiar with evangelicalism. Am I coming up on the thing? Okay.
Oh yeah, you're good.
Okay. I wasn't even familiar with it until I probably towards my maybe junior or senior year of college. I grew up in church. My father's a pastor, Black, non-denominational, more kind of Pentecostal. So that was my growing up. So I had no association to evangelicalism at all until I went to grad school at Liberty. And so I think people assume that I grew up in an evangelical context because I went to Liberty, and that because I'm an apologist. So apologetics in America usually centers around white evangelicalism. So me as a Black woman and coming from non-denom Pentecostalism is an anomaly to be leading an apologetics organization. So I interact with evangelicalism all the time. I speak at evangelical conferences because that's where a great emphasis, a great deal of work is done in apologetics. So right. For my field, it makes sense. But so that's kind of my story, and me being the Liberty was a total culture shock.
Yes, we can share stories. We can trade war stories, Lisa.
So that's kind of been my introduction to apologetics, was me going to an evangelical seminary, but never identifying with evangelicalism as just never ever identified. That's why I said no, because I'm like, no, I kind of grew up Black church all my time. Even when I went to Liberty, I went to a Black church. So I was trained in the conservative evangelical school. So
now, Ekemini, you've been very public about the fact that you grew up in non-denom, egalitarian style Black church. You've said that on Twitter before, and that you never considered yourself, that collectively your church never considered itself evangelical, would use that label, correct?
Yeah, no. Well, actually, technically, I actually grew up in a Lutheran church, like from infancy until I was about 18. So the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is a mainline Protestant denomination. So that's actually not even evangelical as it is. And then I got saved in a non-denominational Black Baptist Pentecostal egalitarian church. And so that's where I cut my teeth. That's where I really came to know the Lord. But yeah, my church, we never identified as evangelical. That's like foreign terminology. It's just like, huh? What does that even mean? We believe the Bible, and we believe Jesus wants us to love our neighbors and love God. That's it, and that's all. And the word is the authority. And so that was just always what, that's just how I always understood the faith. And so I guess in some ways my association with evangelicalism, if you want to call it that, is because of where I went to school for seminary. It wasn't until I went to seminary that I was like, oh, okay. Meaning what? So one of the most evangelical, like Reformed seminaries in the world. So I was like, oh, okay. I didn't know. I was just following God. That's all I knew. And so then I got plopped into this seminary. And so I think that's in some ways kind of some parallels with Lisa in that way, where it's just like, I'm in it, but not I've never identified as evangelical. So it's something, this is like a new thing for me. Like, I'm like, huh? It's foreign. I don't know. There's too much. Anyways, I'm sure we'll go into why and what that looks like. But yeah,
absolutely. Now, Jemar, we've talked about kind of your background on the podcast before, so I won't ask you that question, but I'll ask you. You kind of made some qualifiers. You laughed before. You kind of wanted to get it out there, like, hey, this. I'll explain it because I think if you say no to evangelical, there's this implicit question underneath that, which is, okay, well, if you don't identify as an evangelical, then what do you identify as? Like, it seems to be for some people, they claim the term because it's the safest term to use. So I'll kick it to Jemar, and then anyone else can kind of hop in and give some thoughts on that as well. But Jemar, why do you think that is? And if someone asked the question, well, if you're not evangelical, then what would you consider yourself as within the kingdom of God? How would you answer that question?
So it's like on Facebook when it says like relationship status, you can say, single in a relationship or quote, it's
They still say that on Facebook? That's like 1998 Facebook, bro.
All right, maybe I'm dating myself here, but there's this kind of middle ground that's not yes or no, it's complicated. And so the way I view evangelicalism, and particularly my relationship to the label, is through multiple lenses. So I think you can look at it theologically. I think you can look at it historically, and I think you can look at it sort of socio-politically. And so theologically, I think all of us, even if it was a predominantly Black church tradition that we grew up in, would agree with, some of the basic tenets, right? Like an emphasis on the Bible is the word of God. That's the authority. You got to have a personal relationship with Jesus. I mean, that's not foreign to most Christian traditions, let alone the Black church tradition. And so if we line up theologically, does that make us evangelical? That's a question. But I think you can also look at it historically. And it's important for Black folks to know that for decades, there were Black people who self-identified as evangelical. Now, that sounds kind of strange to us because we're sitting here on the far side of the moral majority and the religious right. And so when we hear evangelical, all of that baggage is coming to fore. But before that, and I've heard, older saints in the faith who identified as Black evangelicals say, in the 50s and 60s, there just wasn't that pronounced a relationship between the socio-cultural and political connotations that we have. So it wasn't necessarily an epithet, but there was still an understanding that evangelicalism, there are a lot of white folks there. Billy Graham is probably the most well-known evangelical, and that kind of characterized the movement. But historically, there were times when Black folks would say, yeah, we're evangelicals. There are differences, but we're evangelical. Now, the matter is, what has evangelicalism become in sort of the popular discourse? And I think that's where evangelical, because it's gotten so associated with the culture wars. It's gotten so associated with voting Republican. It's gotten so associated with social and political conservatism. And it just leaves out really most people who aren't white. I mean, it's not just Black people, right? Mm-hmm. So, and I think that narrative has become so powerful and so negative that even with all these other qualifications theologically and historically, it would be troublesome to publicly identify as an evangelical. But the question of labels is still there. So for the Witness, we say we are a Black Christian collective. And, that could be a very broad swath of Christianity. And so we just try to convey through content and theme and tone the kind of Christians we are.
Now, I'm hearing some sort of separation between classic understanding of what evangelical is and modern understanding of what an evangelical is. And I'm hearing you separate those things, Jemar. Anybody want to hop in on that idea of is it right to separate those things? Has it been as pronounced of a shift? Because I've heard some people, it's a huge difference between what evangelicalism was founded upon. And then other people are saying, well, I mean, it's not that much different. It's just a little bit different. Anybody want to hop in on that?
I think the assumption is that to be a biblical Christian means to be an evangelical Christian. And I think that's problematic because when people say, well, I hold a high view of scripture, I hold the Bible is authoritative. I believe, you know, that in all of Scripture, that you are somehow just boxed into evangelicalism. And I think that's problematic because a high view of Scripture didn't start with evangelicalism. And I believe that it's problematic to make that assumption. I think it's also problematic because it doesn't include the fact that evangelicalism at its foundation had racism present with the founders. So I think that in ideals, there was a list of ideas that were quote unquote biblical, but I think just like the Declaration of Independence, the foundation of evangelicalism missed the mark of what it claimed to represent. Mm-hmm. So just like America has these ideas that all men are created equal, evangelicalism had a high view of Scripture and said that, you know, all men are made in the image of God, but treated Black and brown as less than. So there's ideals that are present that they're never lived up to. So I think maybe aligning myself with evangelicalism means I want to align myself with a group that missed the mark of what biblical Christianity is. And so that's why, for me, I would just say I'm a biblical Christian. I'm a Christian that follows Scripture without identifying myself with a certain group because of the baggage that comes along with it.
That's good. That's good. I mean, Lisa is like, I'm like, okay, we done. She preached. She preached the word.
It didn't start with evangelicalism.
So, no, I thought that was good. Well, that's what's interesting, making the theological distinctions and I guess the political ones. I have a couple of things I want to say about that. I guess the first thing is with evangelicalism, I think it's just so broad and it's so muddied now that if you say everything, that you end up saying nothing. And so if I go down the street and ask somebody what evangelicalism is, they probably are going to tell me that white, Republican, if they even know what it means, right? It seems to be nebulous, right? And there's another aspect there where I would want to identify with what the saints around the world are identifying with. I think evangelicalism is an American convention construct, if you will. And so, and it's a very recent construct or invention, if you will. And so it's always changing, it's always evolving. That's the nature of language and terms, right? So evangelicalism, what it meant when Jamar was historically doesn't necessarily mean what it means today. And so I think that's why it is problematic. And there's a lot of hubris there, just thinking like, if you're not evangelical, then you're an unorthodox Christian or you're not a Christian. That's very American, right? that's very self-centered, very, very arrogant. Particularly when you think about the fact that when I even think about the Protestant Reformation and the fact that Martin Luther was actually influenced by the Church of Ethiopia, Amen, who had actually already been walking in what we now know to be Protestantism. They were doing that way before the Europeans caught on to that. And so I think there's a word in there for white evangelicals to actually learn from people from the margins, learn from the Black church, learn from our Latino and Latina communities. And so anyways, I say that all that to say that I think it's just too broad. And so there's just too much confusion. And I like precise terms. Now, I know Christian is also broad. I know that. But I know the saints in Myanmar call themselves Christians. I know the Christians in Sudan call themselves Christians. And they're dying for that label. Okay? I don't see anybody dying on the altar for evangelicalism. Except for Americans here who want to die on the hill of their political idolatry. And you live by that, you will die by that. So that's all I'm going to say for now.
Okay, so all that tea just got spilled all over my laptop right then.
But don't we recognize the in terms of people abroad calling themselves Christian, that's also a very different sort of religious landscape than in America, right? So where in America, to be Christian is not that controversial. Well, depends on who you ask, but by and large, right? As compared to somewhere like Myanmar. Okay, so I just there's those differences there. But again, I mean, I'm on the same page because we are Black Christian Collective because of all of the baggage that comes with evangelicalism.
Now, Katelyn, I heard you. Yeah, I want you to get in, Katelyn, because I heard you once say that that the average, you quoted someone said the average evangelical is an African woman. Is that right? So it's changed now from, or the average identifying like Christ follower, because there's a difference between the international and the American.
Sure, but just theologically, in terms of numbers, we know about the incredible spread of a more kind of charismatic, conversionistic Christianity in the global South. And whether or not they use the word evangelical, and many of them don't and would understand it as a totally American foreign term, we get caught in an American silo when we talk about evangelicalism. Like our mind goes to white, male, Republican, but globally, that is not who your average quote unquote evangelical is, if we're speaking just theologically. And it's interesting. I feel like inherent to the evangelical movement is all this hand wringing about what we mean by evangelical. And there's a lot of energy spent on boundaries keeping that I think is navel gazing and could be destructive when we should just be going about the business of getting on with loving God and loving our neighbor. And so when I identify as an evangelical, I know you asked for a one-word answer, so I just had to gulp and say it. But of course, my answer would be, well, it totally depends on what you mean by that word. And I think part of my desire to keep the label is to say, like, can I name drop? Can I like say people's names?
Go, do whatever.
Okay.
I mean, you don't care. Go.
Okay, so like, part of me wants to say, Jerry Falwell Jr. and Franklin Graham do not get to define what an evangelical is. They may be the loudest and the most obnoxious, and they may get the headlines, but what if they're the fake evangelicals? And what if the people who are at my church, who love God and love their neighbor and work for others flourishing, what if they're the real evangelicals? So of course there's a lot of hand wringing around the word, but I want to reclaim it as a way. I want to continue to claim it as a way of reforming what it is from within.
Yeah.
Well, now you might check in with me 10 years from now and see if I'm still committed to doing that. But that's where I am these days.
Now, Katelyn, you're speaking really to scope of the word evangelical. And some people I've heard of say that the word is defined too broadly. Like there are too many people who claim the label who are not authentic to the tenets. And then I've heard other people say this is too narrow. Like, so we're trying to kind of reduce it down to this precise, very small group of people, when in reality, it actually is a little bit broader. Anybody want to talk about scope? Too broad, too narrow, just right? Where is the term evangelical as far as scope? And then we'll get into some individuals as it relates to Black Christians and women.
So I've heard a lot of pushback about the polls that national news outlets produce and publicize. And folks are like, because it'll have some statistic that reflects horribly on evangelicalism, right? And then the response is, well, how are you defining evangelical? Because that's not how I think, hashtag not all evangelicals, right? But here's my thing. I think at some point you have to own the fact that these folks feel comfortable identifying themselves as evangelical. Mm-hmm. Like that came along somewhere. Mm-hmm. And what I really think folks need to do is look at the church level, because I've spoken at dozens of churches, interacted with literally hundreds of white evangelicals. And at the grassroots layperson level, they are conservative politically, conservative socially. They will vote Republican. They will have very similar outlooks on racial issues, mass incarceration, all of those things. And so when they see the polls or whatever, they may have this reaction like, ooh, that's not me. But wait a minute. When you go in the voting booth, or when you invite a speaker to your church, or when you push back on an artist or a theologian who's talking about systemic injustice, aren't you falling into all of those kind of same ideologies and belief patterns, that's where I think the rubber hits the road. And if we're not dealing with that, then you can say, ew, that's not my kind of evangelicalism all you want. But when I walk into your church, I still get that same vibe.
Yeah, what I hear you saying, Jamar, is like, even in my ideal world, evangelicalism would be broader and it wouldn't mean all those default things. But at the end of the day, you talk to an average, white person who identifies as an evangelical, and they kind of tick most of those boxes, and you have to own that. And this the stereotype is coming from an actual place of majority within the movement.
Yeah, I mean, and I wasn't talking directly to you, Caitlin. I was just on my soapbox. And I just know, Jamar, we got to interrogate the people in the pews, where they're getting their news, what they're hearing from the pulpit. And they may not turn the volume up as high as a Jerry Falwell or somebody, but honestly, if I post a particular article on Facebook, I'm gonna still get that pushback. You know what I'm saying? So until those kinds of things change, these like baseline beliefs about how the world works, which is very centered on whiteness, very centered on being used to systems working in your favor, until that starts to change, I don't see all the hand-wringing about defining evangelicalism as very helpful, because at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, there's not that big of a difference.
Ekemini, I want to. You shared something recently. It was actually a while back. You said that it was a quote from the New York Times. It says 74% of white evangelicals believe things have changed for the worse since the 1950s. And so that was, a poll, narrow poll, whatever it may be. But you talked about, and you've mentioned before, kind of this fear that white evangelicals have of losing control. They're captive to the empire, you said. So can you talk about that fear of marginalization, which causes the socio-political ramifications of evangelical to be muddied now from what the original intent was that we defined at the beginning?
Yeah, that reminds me of, remember Dr. Martin Luther King talking about, I think in his book, Why We Can't Wait, talking about how, or maybe it was, it was in Why We Can't Wait, talking about how the privileged people rarely give up their privileges voluntarily, right? So nobody wants to give up anything that they benefit from. So I think that they are most definitely held captive to empire. And we saw that with this last election, with 81% voting for Trump and still standing by him. And we see much of that repeated even in a bit of a microcosm, or if I can even say that really, in Alabama with Roy Moore, what's happening there, right?
Absolutely.
And so there is this golden calf of desire for power, desire for, not even just desire of power, but to lord it over the more marginalized. We see what's happening with the tax bill. We see what's happening with this relentless desire to strip healthcare away from the poor. I mean, literally seeking to plunder people that have the least, and leave them without. We see the plundering of the land of Native Americans with the whole Bear Ears legislation that 45 just passed. So there's a lot going on here. Very, very pointed attacks against the marginalized that are in play here. And so that's what I mean when I'm saying that they're held captive to empire. This desire to hold on to what is temporal, to hold on to this power, to hold on to the wealth, to hold on to, instead of losing their life, right, for the sake of the gospel, they want to keep it and save it. And whoever is seeking to save their life will lose it, right? And so we're not fearing the one that can kill the body and soul in hell. They're fearing the one, that can actually kill the body. And that's just like, come on. So that's something so I think that's what I'm speaking to when I'm speaking about that. And so, but yeah, I mean, the reality is that if you benefit from something, you don't want to let it go. And there's a lot of money to be had, particularly in the evangelical industrial complex. There's book deals, there's speaker circuit deals. You get op-eds, your name is all over on the headlines. There's all types of privileges that come along with this, right? You get to be a talking head. There's a whole lot of things that come to you as you being the darling evangelical, whoever that might be. And so people don't want to let go of that label. Sometimes even if there's nothing, really that can be gained by keeping it, right? I mean, I don't know. I personally don't like to take on labels that I'm not going to have in the new heavens and new earth personally. So when Christ comes back and restores order and restoration happens, am I going to be an evangelical in heaven? No, I'm going to be a servant of the Lord. I'm going to be a Christian. I'm going to be. So for me, I want to keep that. And I will also be a woman. I will also be Black, specifically Nigerian. I will also, this hair, I will still have, all of these things I will retain. Personally, I never want to take on additional labels that I won't keep with me. For all eternity. So anyway, that's a whole lot. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that's helpful. Lisa, get in and talk about how the Black churches view evangelicalism, how that shift has taken hold, because now it seems like that's the popular conversation. I was listening to your interview with Mary Beth Matthews, who talks about Doctrine and Race, who wrote the book Doctrine and Race, and she talks about how she was surprised to see how fundamentalist or Black pastors who are Christian were tuned into fundamentalists, like white fundamentalists. And she mentions, it was really a powerful quote. She said, it's because they needed to know who was the group that was othering them. They need to be familiar with the people who were othering them. And so how have Black Christians and Black churches now kind of turned their gaze toward this conversation, or it's not even a thing that we talk about, within that context? Talk a little bit about that evolving notion of what evangelical is in that context.
I don't even know if I can answer that holistically. But what I can say to it is I think that because when we talk about the Black church, I think we define it as it's one thing when there are so many different Black churches within the Black church. Yes. So I like to use the term, how have Black churches kind of wrestle with it. And I think something that Mary Beth said that was really crucial was that Black churches had to be in tune with how white churches were othering them, where white churches didn't have to pay attention to Black churches. So they would make up all these caricatures and think that we as African Americans were easily swayed. We couldn't basically defend our faith, or we didn't actually know what we believed. And so they kind of othered us and put us in a project category, like there's somebody they have to help and rescue. You even hear that language in slavery, they were saving heathen souls when they brought us over here. So I think that's problematic that they kind of have us in the category of ignorance. It's when it comes to faith. But Black people have to know what's going on in white circles, just outside of church, in any form of culture. We have to know both sides, and they don't necessarily have to know about us. So I think that's the history. But I think there's other groups. Like I grew up in my church context, we weren't concerned about white evangelicals at all. Like we weren't even like it just crossed our mind. We were too busy living. It wasn't a care. And I think for a lot of churches, Black churches that are maybe you're more charismatic, Pentecostal, even Baptist.
Oh yeah, no.
A lot of churches aren't concerned with evangelicalism at all. Like not even a thought. I know me growing up, it wasn't even a thought. It wasn't until I think the political landscape makes it obviously more problematic because of we have President Trump. But I think a lot of people aren't really concerned, aren't really paying it attention, and frankly don't care. Because I think one thing that T.D. Jakes said a long time ago when he was on the Elephant Room, he said that Black people, especially during the Civil Rights era, we didn't have time to argue about
theology.
Theology. We were too busy trying to survive. We had real opposition, so we didn't have time to argue about theology. Is really a privilege. Yeah. And so I think the more educated Black people become, we have the privilege to think about the theological distinctives of different groups. But I think back then they weren't necessarily concerned about it because they had so much going on.
I'm so glad you brought that up again, Lisa, because I think it gets back to Katelyn's point about evangelicalism really being very concerned about boundaries and saying who we are, and even more specifically, who we aren't. And in a sense, that points to sort of the cultural comfortability that we have as Christians. Not that those issues aren't important, but if we look at the global church and people facing like life and death persecution because of their faith, which also has affected African Americans, both historically and in the present, then you're right. It's like, okay, look, do you love Jesus? Okay, let's go. Like, let's be about the business of being Christian, because there are people suffering. There are people who need to hear about Jesus, and we can't have all of these intramural fights over who is this or who isn't that, or do you parse it this way or that way. Again, not that there's not occasions for that, but I wonder if we've gotten so caught up in defining who we are and putting labels on ourselves that we don't have time to actually be about the business of our Father. And so part of it is, that return to, look, I'm just Christian. You can fight over that if you want, but look, I got work to do. And so I think part of what's happening now is a sifting in the American church, who identifies as Christian, and what they really mean is I'm conservative socially and politically, but that's not Christianity. And who is really trying to die to self, take up their cross daily and follow Christ, which is going to go counter to Democrats, is going to go counter to Republicans, it's going to go counter to your own desires, or it's going to line up at some points. And so I'm trying to consciously think about, what does it mean to live as a Christ follower and not just call myself one?
Now, Katelyn, Lisa talked about this difference of, Black Christians having at some points to think about, the broader white church or white Christians or the white majority in general. But white Christians and white people not having to think about that in reverse. That was the whole premise of your tweet, right? Like your whole premise of your tweet was include these people. And so speak about it. What are we missing? What is broader evangelicalism missing from your perspective when it comes to women and when it comes to people of color, that they can learn, that they can tangibly take and say, this actually applies to enhancing the church, to teaching the church, to the church learning something from these groups of people?
Yeah, two thoughts come to mind. I think you're right. I think it was Jemar talking about it was Ekemini talking about the fear that we see a lot of white evangelicals kind of beholden to, that they're going to lose this sense of cultural power, that they're beholden to the empire, and that it's ultimately an idol that is working them up into this fear. Whenever I hear conversations among white Christians about, like, they're taking away our rights, or there's going to be this time in the near future when we will be persecuted, when we won't be able to preach the gospel, I just think, like, you don't even realize how much privilege you enjoy, how much centering you continue to enjoy in the United States. The African American church tradition has always flourished on the margins. And if white Christians are so worried about loss of power and being othered, so to speak, like maybe it's time for them to sit back and learn from fellow Christians who have not only survived but thrived from places of marginalization in American society. So that would be the first thing that comes to mind. The second thing is that I think Jamar and I were talking earlier this week, and he used the word syncretism to describe the kind of melding of white Christian theology and kind of a conservative political ideology, that there's a syncretism in a lot of white evangelicalism that we're seeing. We saw it play in the election. We're seeing it play in Alabama. The problem with that syncretism is not simply that, my fellow white evangelicals believe things that I find annoying or frustrating. It's that they've actually forsaken core biblical teaching in that syncretism. So if your conception of sin is only individualistic, and it's not also systemic, and it's not also calling into questions the powers and principalities that are against the Spirit of God and that affect systems and structures and not just individuals, you're actually forsaking a key part of the Bible. Like you have strayed from the biblical teaching. If your Christianity is primarily about the preservation and safety of you and your family, and that's it, you have lost a vision of social flourishing for your neighbor that is inherent to the gospel. So, I think I'm born for the evangelical world, not simply because, a lot of evangelicals voted for a president that I couldn't vote for, but because there's something there, the core of the faith is at risk in this syncretism that has happened in white evangelicalism. And I look to people like Truth Table and Pass the Mic and the AND campaign and think, this is a biblical vision, a fully biblical vision of Christianity that I can latch onto, or that makes sense, that makes sense to me, and that answers some of the weakness, the theological and spiritual weakness that's happening within the evangelical movement.
Yeah, that's very helpful from a theological context and socially as well. Let me ask you guys this, Lisa and Ekemini, what is one issue that for evangelicalism to relinquish its obsession with empire and being captive to empire, the socio-political, what's one issue that they have to confront?
It's a lot.
One issue that must be confronted, that's like foundational. You can't get away from this. What is it?
Well, okay, so can I go back and say a little something? Because you were talking about what's the blind spot you said of evangelicalism?
Yeah, go ahead.
I riff on that for a little bit, right? Because I got that. But I think a blind spot it's not just a minor blind spot. There is a wall, right? There's a wall, and it's called a wall of whiteness, as Mrs. Laura Pritchard said. She's a multi-ethnic, anti-racist trainer in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and she talked about the wall of whiteness. It's like, and I think a function of white supremacy is that you can't see beyond whiteness, right? So this impacts white people and it impacts people of color. So then we start to think white is the standard that we should be aiming for. It's not. White people think whiteness is the norm. It's not. And whiteness is a construct, and it's wicked, and it will be thrown into the pit of hell. And so we need white people to embrace their ethnicity. This is what we're talking about when I say that. So it's not just a blind spot. We're talking about a wall of whiteness, and you just can't see beyond that. That's number one. Number two, which I guess would feed into what's the one thing. There's so many. I would say this. I think this. How can we say this facade of pro-life? If
all right.
white evangelicals are truly, because I was trying to choose between that and the GOP, and where I think I could kill two birds with one stone by saying pro-life. And so if white evangelicals are truly pro-life, then I should see the ELRC and every other org that is pro-life, SBC, rallying right now in Flint, Michigan, to figure out why the people of Flint are still being poisoned, number one, okay? Because white supremacy is ubiquitous and it's in our water as well. It's called environmental racism. Then we'd be trying to figure out why is it that the women of Flint are miscarrying their children.
Yeah. Yeah.
The very children that you claim to say that you love and that you care, that you can't see, you know, technically you can't see, right? You know, but you're saying you love this guy, but you can't, you're telling me you love the baby in that womb, but you're not rallying to figure out why and how we can preserve these lives from actually being miscarried. And then you're going to go and tell me that you care about Keisha's baby that she's about to go abort down the street. It doesn't add up. It doesn't add up. So that would be what I would say.
I don't know how y'all gonna follow that one. But.
Wow.
I would say for me that why evangelicals see Black and brown people as women as image bearers, because I think there's, even though it's said, it's not always. It's like, I understand that Black and brown people of God, but we're still treated differently. I think about when I go in certain spaces and I say, I do apologetics in that for African American context. And the first assumption is that I'm doing apologetics to inner city youth. Or the first assumption is I'm helping somebody. Somebody said at a conference that I was just at, when I mentioned Black and apologetics, they said, oh man, we really got to help these single moms. And I'm like, what?
Excuse me?
Like, why? How are we getting there? Like, how are we Black apologetic single mom? How did we get there? Or Black and apologetics, you're helping these inner city youth. You know, and it would be sarcastic of me to say, if they're doing white apologetics, oh, so are we going to deal with the opioid crisis? Like, you know, that would be a false assumption, because they'd be like, well, how did we get there? Or, you know, are we going to deal with the meth crisis? Like, but when Black and brown and anything is brought up, the first assumption is poor Black people. And I think it goes to the fact that white evangelicals don't always see Black people as made in the image of God. They just see us as people to be rescued and saved and projects. And so I think it has to go beyond just saying, oh, Black and brown, everybody's made in the image of God, but living up and treating people as if they're people just like you, and they're not all we're not a one-dimensional person. Just like when they say Black church and they throw all these in, like there are Black churches that are different. There are Black people that are different. You know, I'm Black, but I didn't grow up in the urban center. I grew up in the suburbs and middle class. And it's just like, they're like blown away by that concept. Like, you know, yeah, my parents have been married for 30 years. So I think just a narrow view of the way they view Black people is problematic. So that would be my thing.
Now, I know we're pressing on time here. And can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, I got disconnected there for a second, so I panicked. But I was screaming over here. I was hoping nobody heard me. Anyway, so I know we're kind of pressed on time, and I want to ask one more question of everyone, and you guys have kind of already touched on it, but Katelyn, you previously mentioned that you said, and I quote, "I believe and I hope that our evangelical family will reclaim the worth of our name." What's the path forward there? How do evangelicals, if you're going to claim that title, if you're going to cling to that, a couple of people in the live chat have even mentioned, you know, global definitions, and getting back to a global view and perspective of the word evangelical, which may be different in different contexts, but in our American context, what's the way forward of reclaiming the worth of the name evangelical?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, it might come from certainly spending less time talking about what we mean by the word evangelical, who's in and who's out, and just getting on with the business of loving God and neighbor. I think we have to reconcile with the fact that this word, which in its root is supposed to mean good news or good news people, sounds like bad news. It sounds increasingly like bad news to a lot of our neighbors. And it could be creating a barrier to the gospel for a lot of our neighbors. And so maybe there's a time when we say, you know what, we're Christians, and the polls will be clear, and how people answer certain questions in polls will be based on, do you read the Bible on a regular basis? Do you pray? Do you worship? Do you theological rather than cultural label? So yeah, I think in a way evangelicals might have to die to the word, recognizing that even if the evangelical movement were to disappear, if it were to fade away, the church would still be strong and God would still be sovereign. And he's not worried. I mean, I'm presuming to speak for God in this moment, but I don't think God is too worried about what's going to happen if the evangelical movement dies. I mean, what if the evangelical movement served its purpose for a time and doesn't anymore, because it's been so compromised. So yeah, in a strange way, I think to get back to the root of the word, we might have to die to the word itself and to some of the navel gazing that it always raises, and kind of reclaim Christian, like the word Christian, as something that I think Ekemini mentioned. If it's good enough for the people in Myanmar, then it's probably good enough for us, right? So
that's good. That's good. Jemar, any thoughts?
Well, Tyler, since you asked, I got two thoughts. Number one, segregation in schools and